Hello there, here with another video, another review, and I've been really enjoying George Harrison at the minute, listening to a lot of his solo stuff, and I'm aware a few weeks ago now I reviewed All Things Must Pass, and I thought, you know what, I might as well start as I mean to go on and do George's albums in chronological order. So logically the next album will be Living in the Material World, and I was going to do that, but then I thought, I don't really want to talk about that album as much as the album I'm going to talk about today, which is what came after that, 1974's Dark Horse. Bit of a controversial album, bit of a divisive album, pretty much slated at the time by critics. That's the front cover, that is the back cover, and it's a gatefold. There is the gatefold. That can go on my stand, unlike All Things Must Pass, this will actually fit on the stand. But yeah, Dark Horse, this came out at a very interesting period in George's life, so I'm going to get up my iPad. I've got all this to talk about today, you lucky things. Hopefully this video won't be as long as the All Things Must Pass video, but I can't make any promises. I'm hoping it'll only be 20 something minutes, but it'll probably end up being 40 something. Anyway, Dark Horse, this album came out on the 9th of December 1974. I think that was in the US. I think over here in the UK it was the 20th of December 1974. But sessions for this album began all the way back in November 1973, and they continued in April 1974, and then kind of properly got going in August to October of 1974. But this period in George Harrison's life was something that he would call a bad domestic year and later refer to as his naughty period. So I believe 1974 for George, it began at a party on New Year's Eve, and as the clock struck midnight, he told his wife, Patty Harrison she was then, that they should get divorced that year. And yeah, that is what happened, or started to happen, because his marriage to Patty Boyd was breaking down. It was pretty much all but over by this point. And he later compared his life to a soap opera at this point, and this album here is sort of like the soundtrack to that soap opera. And yeah, you can definitely get the impression it's a soap opera. It is like, I don't know, Coronation Street or other soap, EastEnders, that's one. But yeah, as I've said, George's marriage to Patty Boyd was breaking down, and by this point George was having numerous affairs. He had an affair with Ringo's wife Maureen, which John Lennon was absolutely furious about, but he even accused George of incest. He also had an affair with Ronnie Wood's wife Chrissy Wood, and Rod Stewart's ex-girlfriend and model Kathy Simmons. Now in return, Ronnie Wood had an affair with Patty Boyd, so they kind of had a wife swap, which is a very 70s thing. Imagine people having a wife swap now. The press would have a field day. But anyway, the whole thing sort of climaxed with Patty Boyd finally running off with Eric Clapton, George's best friend, in July of 74. So for the last few years, Eric Clapton had been absolutely obsessing over Patty. He'd wrote Layla about her, for example, and a few songs, and he was crazy for her. And he was constantly trying to convince her to leave George for him, and he finally got to her. And yeah, she took off in July with him. And that is kind of the basis of a lot of the songs on this album. It's very much about his marriage breaking down, George being alone again. And it's very interesting because George, as a writer and as a musician, he doesn't really write much about his personal life. This is without doubt the album that gives you the biggest insight into his personal life and what he was feeling at that point. You know, he's normally more writing about, I was going to say religious stuff, but like his views on the world and stuff is more what he would write about rather than himself and his personal feelings. But on this album he is doing that, and particularly the breakdown of his marriage. So yeah, that is a big theme throughout this album. But with his marriage breaking down, George decided to immerse himself in work, and boy did he push himself. He really, really did immerse himself. So he worked extensively throughout 1974 with Ravi Shankar and a group called Splinter. This was all whilst he was working on his own music, and I think he was working with other bands, musicians and stuff. I think he probably worked with Billy Preston at this point, some of his stuff. So yeah, George was really pushing himself to help other musicians, help other artists out, produce them, write songs for them, whatever. I think Splinter took up a lot of his work. Yeah, he was also heavily involved in all the business issues at this point, with the fallout of the Beatles breakup, with Apple. There's Apple. With Apple, and by this point, John, George and Ringo were breaking from Alan Klein. They were ditching him, which Alan Klein wasn't particularly happy about. And the lawsuit that Paul McCartney had filed in December 1970 to break up the Beatles' business partnership was coming to a climax this year. It would be it was I think in December of 74, around when this album came out, when it finally all concluded that. But the business stuff was getting really heavy for George at this point, so he was heavily involved in that. He was also involved as an executive producer in the film Little Malcolm. I believe that was an Apple film. Never seen it, never heard of it, but he was heavily involved in it. So yeah, George was a very busy man, really overworking himself throughout this period, with all the stuff in his personal life, all the stuff in his professional life. And feeling all this pressure, he began drinking very heavily and returning to his drug-taking ways of the 1960s. So I think George had kind of given up drugs completely because of his beliefs in Hinduism and all of this stuff. But yeah, he kind of went off the wagon a bit here and returned to it. And I think cocaine in particular was what he was taking around the period of this album. But yeah, in January 1974, he decided to escape his marriage issues by running away to India to spend 2 months with Ravi Shankar. George had not been to India since the Beatles went there in 1968 when they went to Rishikesh. So yeah, it'd been a while. I think this was his first solo trip there since 1966. So yeah, George was a very busy man at this point. And as the year went on, because he was pushing himself more and more, his voice was starting to get very hoarse, and it was failing, his voice, because he was pushing himself far too much. So to top it all off, George decided at the end of 1974 he would embark on this solo US tour. This would be the first solo Beatle tour of the US. None of the others had done it up to this point, so George was the first. And he would do it as a co-headline tour with Ravi Shankar. Now, convention at the time, I don't quite understand why, meant that in order to tour the US, you had to be doing it in support of a new album, which meant George had no choice but to finish this album off, which he'd kind of been neglecting because he'd been that busy working with other musicians, spending time in India, his marriage falling apart, the business stuff with the Beatles breakup, his drug taking and whatever, his work as an executive producer on films. But now he had to finish this before he could go on tour. He'd given himself a deadline because his tour began in November. I believe its tour itself had been inspired by Ravi Shankar's tour of Europe with his Indian musicians. Yeah. So because George's voice had been becoming more hoarse because of all the overworking he'd been doing, he hadn't finished the vocals for this album. So come October 1974, he still had them all to do. And he went at it. He really went to town with the vocals, pushing himself to get them done. And he blew it. He blew his voice. And he ended up contracting laryngitis. And yeah, the poor thing. You can hear it on this album. That is one of the biggest criticisms with this album, George's voice. He is really struggling. His voice is very hoarse. Yeah. And then, of course, he went on the tour still. He didn't cancel it. He kept going, despite the fact that his voice was pretty much shattered. So, yeah. Harrison went on to later admit in later years that at this period, by the time he went on tour and finished this album off, he was absolutely knackered. But he still had a tour to do. And, yeah, I think most people would have either cancelled or postponed the tour to probably sometime in 75, but George didn't want to. He wanted to get it done. Anyway, the tour itself, many critics slammed the tour because it was a co-headline tour, so Ravi Shankar was on as much as George, and the vast amount of people were there to see George Harrison, one of the ex-Beatles. They weren't there to see Ravi Shankar and his boys playing the sitar and whatnot. So yeah, they had to make do with, I don't know, however long Ravi Shankar was on, an hour or something of him. And then when George did come on, people weren't particularly happy because he wasn't really indulging in his Beatles past. In his entire set, he only had 4 Beatles songs, which were Something, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, For You Blue, and he did a cover of In My Life for some reason. But obviously at this point, because of his marriage breaking down, he was also changing the lyrics to songs like Something, because obviously that was about Pattie Boyd. And the lyrics like Attract Me Like No Other Lover, he was changing them to Find Yourself Another Lover. So yeah, he was very much not taking it serious, and it was predominantly performing his solo stuff, and people obviously wanted to hear Beatles songs. And of course, the biggest criticism I think George got was his shredded vocals, the quality of his voice. With critics, yeah, they were not impressed with George's vocals on this tour, to put it politely. Harrison had also annoyed a lot of people, because in 1974 there was a lot of anticipation for a Beatles reunion. But George in a press conference said that he would happily work in a band with John Lennon again, but he would never want to be in a band with Paul McCartney again. And he went as far as to say he preferred Willie Weeks as a bass player to Paul McCartney. Willie Weeks was in George's band, he was the bass player in George's band. So despite all the criticism of the tour, from critics and the press, fans and attendees actually seemed to quite like it. It was a chance to see George Harrison in concert. But despite fans enjoying it, it kind of scarred George, and he never toured again. It would be 1991 when he next went on tour, which was just a very brief tour of Japan with Eric Clapton. So, yeah, one and only time I think George toured the US, or played a live concert in the US for that matter. Yeah, upon the release of this album anyway, coming back to the album, it was some of the most negative reviews that any solo Beatle album had got up until this point. It was getting slated more than the likes of Wildlife by Wings and Ringo's albums. It was getting absolutely panned, this album. Rolling Stone magazine went as far as to call it a disastrous album to match a disastrous tour. And in terms of chart positions, this was the first solo Beatles album not to chart here in the UK, which is absolutely remarkable because it's only 1974, it's only 4 years since the Beatles split, and All Things Must Pass wasn't that old an album, and Living in the Material World had done pretty well, and then suddenly this album, it doesn't chart here in the UK. So yeah, George was the first Beatle to have an album not to chart, and I don't think this was probably his only album that didn't chart. I'm not sure with the likes of Gone Troppo off the top of my head where that charted, but I don't think it'll have happened to him a lot. Paul is obviously, I think all Paul's albums have charted. Same with Lennon's, but Ringo, I'm sorry Ringo, you've obviously found yourself in that position quite a bit. But yeah, over in the US, I believe this album did get to number 4, but I imagine that was helped by the tour. Maybe if he'd done a tour here in the UK as well, it would have managed to chart. But anyway, the artwork. I really like this artwork. Of all the George Harrison solo albums, this is probably my favourite album cover. So for those of you that don't know this photo, it is the 1956 Liverpool Institute High School photo, and it's been superimposed on a watercolour painting. So that there is George with the blue face in the middle. These are all the teachers, I believe. The ones that have things like the Dark Horse logo and I've forgotten what that is, the religious thing that George is into. I really should have looked that up. These are the teachers he liked, and then the ones who get like the record labels and whatnot, and the press, the LA Express, etc. These are the ones that George did not like. But yeah, this album itself, it kind of very much reminds me of the Sgt. Pepper cover. It's very colourful. I like that. I like a colourful cover. Definitely George's best album cover, in my opinion. So yeah, anyway, the album itself. We're going to go into the track-by-track review. That is the background. There's a hell of a lot to this album. And yeah, let's just get into this. So it opens with the opening track, funnily enough, which is Harry's on Tour, Express. So this is an instrumental, and this is what he opened the tour with, funnily enough. Every gig on the tour, It's an instrumental and it's just a fun song. It's just his band having fun. I love the saxophone on this. Yeah, it goes to show George's band at this point was very, very tight. They were like, it was kind of like a funk band and soul music and stuff. They were really, really good. Willie Weeks on the bass in particular is very good. I know George said that he preferred Willie Weeks as a bassist to Paul McCartney, but let's not beat around the bush here. Paul McCartney is a better bassist than Willie Weeks, but Willie Weeks is bloody good on this album. The slide guitar on this song as well is very good. There's a lot of slide guitar from George on this album, which is all top notch. But yeah, Harry's onto it. It's a fun instrumental opening track, and yeah, puts you in a good mood. It sounds like the theme tune to a soap opera, which is ironic because George obviously referred to this period as a soap opera. So if this album is a soap opera, here is your opening, your credits, your opening credits. Anyway, we then enter an interesting period of the album because this is the point where back to back George is doing song after song about the breakup of his marriage. So we're about to find out some of the most personal lyrics George has ever written. And we start off with the second track, which is Simply Shady. So this is obviously about Patty and their divorce. And George later will go on to say that this was the song that perfectly summed up this period of his life. It's very rare for George to be this open about his personal life and his feelings when he's singing about feeling alone and whatnot. I've got the wrong song. I think that's another song. He's singing stuff like, "You may think of a lady, cause yourself a minor war, and you won't, and your life won't be so easy anymore." What a wonderful lyric that is. Yeah, really, really good. And it's kind of a relatable song to me at the moment, this. But for a lot of people who are going through similar things to what George was at this period, they will find this song very relatable. The band here, they're very, very solid. And George, this is obviously George's first vocals on the album, and despite the fact his voice was in pretty poor condition at this period, it's good on this song. I like George's voice on this song. It's, yeah, it is a bit hoarse, but who cares? It still sounds good. This, in my opinion, is a contender for best song on the album. I really, really like Simply Shady. And there's a nice little reference to Sexy Sadie towards the end of the song. You may think you're Sexy Sadie or whatever. Yeah, really good. Nice little Beatle reference. Right, after that we have the track So Sad. Yeah, which George obviously was very sad at this point because his marriage had broke down. His wife had taken off with his best friend. So yeah, this is obviously about Patty and their divorce. Now, interestingly, this song is kind of like the opposite to Here Comes the Sun. So Here Comes the Sun is obviously like winter is ending, here comes the spring, it's giving you hope. And it's just an all-round hopeful song. This is the other end now. The autumn is ending and we're going into the dark winters and all that hope is gone. Yeah, so the opposite of Here Comes the Sun, really. Really good chorus on this song. But he feels so alone with no love of his own. So bad, so sad. Or maybe so sad, so bad. Anyway, one of those. But yeah, it's one of my favourite songs on the album. This again, George sounds like he's really sad, which isn't the reason it's my favourite. But George, he does sound like he's sad when he's singing this, and he sounds like he is hurting. He does sound genuinely upset that Patty is gone. Yeah, it's one of my favourite breakup songs. This, you know, I'm not particularly massive fan of breakup songs. Otherwise, I'd be sat here reviewing Taylor Swift albums. But this is a really good one. And the third verse in particular is one of my favourite verses ever. I think the lyrics of the third verse are absolutely brilliant, to the point where I've even wrote them down in full here and I'm going to read them to you. Take the dawn of a day. I'm going to start that again because it's take the dawn of the day and give it away to someone who can fill the part of the dream we once held. Now it's got to be shelved. It's too late to make a new start. What he's effectively singing here is take the dawn of the day, give it away to Eric Clapton, who can fill in George's part now with Patty. And the dream that George and Patty once had, it's got to be shelved because that is now the dream that Eric and Patty will have instead. And it's too late for George to make a new start with her. So yeah, obviously, he doesn't directly name Eric or Patty, which is good because it means it can be used for anybody. Yeah, that lyric in particular, it really does hit home with it. But anyway, this song overall, it's a brilliant song through and through. I really, really like So Bad. Not So Bad. So Sad. So Bad's a Paul McCartney song. Right, track 4, Bye Bye Love. This is a cover, this was originally by the Everly Brothers, but George has gone a bit further and added his own lyrics to it. And the lyrics that he's added are the only lyrics on the album that directly reference Patty and Eric. I think it's There Goes Our Lady with You Know Who. I hope she's happy and Old Clapper too. So yeah, he's added all that in. That verse is what George has added, and he's even directly talking about when he chucked them both out his house, which is very interesting. But the actual song itself, it's much more acoustic than the previous tracks. It's a really good song. Some critics went as far as to say this was the best on the album because it was a cover. And yeah, obviously the Everly Brothers originally. Bass on this song is excellent. Willie Weeks is doing a brilliant job. That's a common trend on this album. The lyric, Goodbye Happiness, Hello Loneliness, is wonderful. Yeah, it's just a wonderful song, and George sounds like he's laying his soul bare here. He's showing his vulnerability, where he's saying goodbye to his happiness, hello to loneliness, and he even goes as far at one point to saying that he thinks he wants to die. Yeah, I think we all know why he's chosen to cover this song, fittingly. But yeah, Bye Bye Love, great song. Right, track 5 and the closing track of side 1, we have Maya Love. So the intro to this is interesting because it kind of reminds me to Marvin Gaye's Heard It Through the Grapevine. Just the way it's kind of building up. Particularly helped by Billy Preston's keyboard playing. But yeah, it does remind me of Heard It Through the Grapevine. But it's a proper good funk song, this. Yeah, it's got a real good groove to it. Billy Preston on the keys. I'm assuming it's Willie Weeks on the bass again. Really, really funky song. In terms of the actual meaning behind the song, it is kind of believed that it's about Pattie Boyd again. Although it's a bit less obvious in this one because Maya Love, this is George leaning more into his beliefs, his religious beliefs and teachings. So unless you understand all that, you're probably not going to fully understand what Maya Love is. Unlike the previous tracks, which any Western audience can understand, you kind of have to know George's beliefs and what it's all about to understand what Maya Love is. So yeah, it's probably about Pattie, but it's not quite as obvious. This song was done live on the tour. It's one of the 3 songs from this album that made it into the set list. I imagine it'd have been really good to see a song this funky live. The slide guitar from George as well, that is absolutely fabulous on this song. Really do enjoy the slide guitar, and the band sound like they're having a lot of fun here. Would have been very good to see live. But yeah, that is track 5. So flip the record over and we have track 6, what was the one and only single over here in the UK, which is Ding Dong Ding Dong. Ironically, as I say that, the doorbell's just rang. You probably didn't hear that, but there we go. Anyway, this was intended to be a New Year's Eve sing-along, and the song itself, it sounds like a party. The lyrics themselves, they're pretty simple. There's not really much to the lyrics. It's basically George is constantly singing ring out the old, ring in the new, which obviously is a New Year thing. But it could also be applied to George's personal life. He's ringing out the old, which is Pattie and the Beatles for that matter, and ringing in the new, which is his current live touring band and his new girlfriend, Olivia, future wife as well. So yeah, that could be what this song, what the ring out the old, ring in the new, is all about. Apparently this is one of the fastest songs George ever wrote, which doesn't surprise me listening to it because there's virtually not a lot of lyrical content to it. It's a very catchy song, but it's probably one of the weaker tracks on the album. I can see why it was a single, but for me it's a bit repetitive. After about a minute and a half you've got the swing of it a bit. Ronnie Wood is on this song, interestingly, playing guitar, but otherwise it's just there really. It's catchy, but it's nothing spectacular. It's the sort of thing I'd kind of expect more from Paul than George. This, it's a very sort of McCartney jaunty sing-along sort of thing. But anyway, track 7 is the title track, Dark Horse. So out of all the tracks on this album, this is where George's struggling vocals are most prominent. He's really struggling to sing this one. And I believe he actually re-recorded this entire thing just before he went off on tour with his live band, which is interesting. Lyrically, this seems to be very much about George in the fact that he was the dark horse. After the Beatles split, most people would assume that Lennon and McCartney would be the most successful. But up until this point, they weren't. George Harrison had been the most successful. All Things Must Pass had been the most successful album. My Sweet Lord had been a phenomenally successful single. The Concert for Bangladesh had been a huge success. Living in the Material World, although it kind of divided people, it was still a success. So yeah, George was the dark horse of the Beatles. He was the unexpected victor up till this point. Of course, the ironic thing is, as he's singing that he's the dark horse, this was the album that kind of lost him his crown of being the most successful Beatle, because it was around this period where Paul kindly took the crown off him and has held on to it since. But I believe there's also a dark horse. It's also a Scouse slang for some sort of sexual relationship, which, knowing George and his sense of humour, he's probably talking about that as well. I don't know what the slang is, to be honest, because I've never heard it before. It must just be a Scouse thing. But anyway, bands sound great on this, especially on the chorus. There's flutes throughout this song, and the flutes in particular on the chorus are top notch. It's a really, really fantastic song. And in 2014, they released an earlier take of this, which is kind of just George on an acoustic guitar, but it was recorded long before the actual version on this album. And if you have a problem with this song and George's vocals, the earlier take is probably going to be good for you, because George's vocals are fine on that. His voice sounds how it normally does. He's obviously recorded that long before his voice was giving him trouble. So that's really nice to have, and it's nice because either version works, the earlier take or the finished take on here, whichever one you listen to, they're both equally good, really. Now, interestingly, when George toured Japan with Eric Clapton in 1991, he did play it very safe with his set list. It was pretty much entirely Beatles songs, All Things Must Pass, and Cloud 9 songs. The only song that came from anywhere else was this song. He randomly threw Dark Horse in, which, yeah, is good because it's a contender for best song on the album. Yeah, really like Dark Horse. I just think the lyrics are very George Harrison. It's very much his sense of humour. And he was the dark horse of the Beatles, really. Yeah, good song. Right, track 8, we have Far East Man. This was co-written with Ronnie Wood, and it was originally released by Ronnie Wood. I think George was on the guitar and backing vocals on Ronnie Wood's version. But George here does it himself. And this is a very soul-heavy song, and it's kind of a taste of what George would do next with extra texture, etc. Yeah, it's soul music, this. And some believe that this song is about Ravi Shankar, because obviously he's from India, so he's the Far East Man, and the lyrics like, we can't let them down. This was George feeling that he can't let Ravi down and not help him with the whole Bangladesh thing, which is why George organised the concert for Bangladesh. So yeah, possibly that is what this song is about, George helping the Far East Man, his friend Ravi Shankar, and the people in need. George's vocals on here are absolutely wonderful, and he even goes to falsetto at one point, which sounds really good. I don't know when, the vocals on this album, for the most part, with the exception of the title track, they don't really sound that bad, to be honest. I actually think, if you weren't to know that George was struggling with his voice, I don't think you'd really have picked up on it for the most part. I don't think it's as bad as what critics made it out to be, with the exception maybe of the title track. A title track, it's interesting because the tour, the Harrison Estate, has never released anything from that tour. So the title track on here is the closest thing you can get to hearing what George sounded like on that tour. Maybe one day they'll release a live album, because we know there is recordings of it, but they've just never released it. So who knows. But this song itself, once again, the band, it's very tight, but the song itself is about 6 minutes, and I do think it goes on a bit for my liking. But it is what it is. There's a nice little dedication at the start to Frank Sinatra, where George says he hopes it's on his next live album at Caesar's Palace. I believe that was George's way of thanking, Frank Sinatra, because around this period Sinatra went and said that Something was the greatest love song of the last 50 years, even though he did refer to it as a Lennon McCartney song. But this is George's way of thanking him. I don't think Frank Sinatra ever did do this one live, but nice anyway. But yeah, Far East, man, it's not one of my favourites on the album. It does go on a bit, but it's not a bad song. And after that, we have the closing track. It Is He, brackets, J.C. Krishna. I think that's how you pronounce it. So this is the only song on the album that is devotional, where George is devoting himself to his beliefs, etc. Which was one of the criticisms of living in the material world, that it was quite religion heavy. So George kind of abandoned that on this album and very much was singing more about his personal life. But this is the one song that breaks with that tradition and kind of refers more back to the previous album and George's beliefs. It's quite a folk rock song, this. It does sound very folky in its music. And what's interesting as well is when he's singing J.C. Krishna, it's in a different sort of melody and tone and tempo to when he starts singing in English. When he starts singing the song in English, tempo completely changes, which is quite a cool little neat thing it does. Surprisingly catchy, this song. It is a very catchy song, but I imagine as well it's a divisive song. I quite like it because it's catchy, but there will be a lot of people out there that do not like this song. My brother, for example, I can guarantee you he's never heard this song, but if he did, he wouldn't like it. Yeah. It's the last time as well that George did a devotional song like this until his last album, Brainwashed. So yeah, it was kind of an ending for George. It'd be the last time in his life that he would release a song like this, because obviously Brainwashed was after he died. But yeah, It Is He. It's a decent closing track, but yeah, it's not a song you're going to listen to a lot, but it's catchy enough. Anyway, that is it. That is Dark Horse's 9 tracks. However, since I'm here, I might as well talk about the B-side, I Don't Care Anymore, which was the B-side to... So over here in the UK, Ding Dong Ding Dong was the only single, so it was the B-side to that. But over in the US, Dark Horse was the only single, so it was the B-side to that. So this song is just George on his own on an acoustic guitar. It's a single take. This is the one and only time he does it. The song itself, it's okay. Apparently George said the whole reason behind it is it's him having a I don't give a shit attitude about anything, about B-sides and everything in general, really. He's just doing this, I think, because he had to do a B-side. I believe the song itself, it's about having lust for a married woman, which is very interesting. Who the married woman is that George is singing about, I don't know. Is it Ronnie Wood's wife? Who knows? Or is he trying to sing this from Eric Clapton's perspective of having lust for George's wife? Who knows? But it's got a bit of a country and western vibe, this song, which isn't something George did very often. But yeah, it's a good little country tune, this. But anyway, that is Dark Horse, George's divisive 3rd post-Beatles album, 5th studio album altogether. For me personally, I really like this album. Yeah, it's it's a guilty pleasure, I would go as far as to say. And it is an album that at the minute, personally, I'm relating to quite a lot because of its lyrics. But yeah, George's voice, it's hitty-missy. Title track, he is struggling on the title track. But otherwise, it's a decent vocal. It's no different really from the rest of his career. But yeah, I think that's really all I've got to say about Dark Horse. If you've never heard it, give it a listen. You'll either love it or hate it. I don't think there's a middle ground with this album. There was one critic that said in order to like this album, you'd have to be an apple scruff, which I am, which is probably why I like it. So, yeah. Anyway, that's all I've got to say for now. So, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you on the next video. Hare Krishna.